Ukraine's Air Force says Russia launched a record number of attack drones and missiles at the country overnight. Thousands of residents spent the night in shelters, including in subway stations or underground parking lots, as explosions and the sound of drones echoed through the city during the attack, which lasted 13 hours. Ukraine's military says Russia launched nearly 540 drones plus 11 ballistic and cruise missiles in the early hours of Friday. The mayor of Kyiv says at least 23 people were wounded. The massive attack came just hours after Ukraine's president said a U.S. company will produce hundreds of thousands of drones this year for the country. This comes as the Trump administration pauses some weapon shipments to Ukraine. President Trump earlier gave an update on his efforts to get a ceasefire in Ukraine.
I'm speaking to President Zelensky tomorrow, early in the morning, and I'm very disappointed with the conversation I had today with President Putin, because I don't think he's there. And I'm very disappointed. Well, it's not, I'm just saying, I don't think he's looking to stop. And that's too bad. This is Biden. This isn't me. This is Biden's war. It wouldn't have happened if I were president. It wouldn't have happened.
Those comments came after President Trump said on Thursday that he did not make any progress toward a ceasefire during his lengthy talk with Russian President Vladimir Putin. According to Russian state media, President Trump talked about ending the war in Ukraine as early as possible. The Kremlin quoted President Putin saying he would continue to try to solve what he called the, quote, root causes of Russia's so-called special military operation in Ukraine. More now on President Trump's call with Vladimir Putin from CNN's Kristen Holmes at the White House.
The White House did not provide any sort of readout of this call. However, President Trump, stopping to talk to reporters, said this.
We had a call. It was a pretty long call. We talked about a lot of things, including Iran. And we also talked about, as you know, the war with Ukraine. And I'm not happy about that.
Now, when pressed by a reporter if he had made any progress in terms of a Ukraine ceasefire, President Trump said they didn't make any progress at all. But again, no real readout from the White House or the president about what happened on this call. However, the Kremlin said that President Trump did bring up ending any kind of military action in Ukraine on Putin's part as soon as possible, which is something that Putin pushed back on, essentially saying that they would not be doing that, saying they were going to be sticking to their goals that addressed the root cause of the issues. The Kremlin clarifying that that meant that nothing was going to change in terms of their posture when it came to Ukraine. One thing that didn't come up on the call, we are told, is the fact that the United States had paused some shipments of munitions to Ukraine. That has been part of a notable shift that we have seen from the White House, from the Pentagon. However, White House officials said that this was part of a review that looked at all of military spending, looked at all of the aid that the United States provides to other foreign nations as part of where they are going for President Trump's agenda. But very interesting to see here, this call, much shorter than what we saw the first time around. And also President Trump, he is seemingly growing frustrated with his inability to solve the crisis in Ukraine. He said so as much that he had made, again, no progress in today's call. Kristen Holmes, CNN, the White House.
CNN's Matthew Chance has more now on what information we can glean from the call between Presidents Trump and Putin.
It's the sixth call that we know about that the two leaders have had. Nothing really substantial seems to have come out of it, except you get a sort of growing sense of the sort of quite courteous relationship between these two political leaders, President Trump of the United States and President Putin of Russia. But according to the readout from the Kremlin, they said that, the issue of ending the military campaign in Ukraine, Russia's military campaign there, was raised pretty quickly in the conversation, but that Vladimir Putin essentially pushed back on it and said, look, we're not going to do that until we've achieved our objectives, our goals, the root causes, as he calls them. That's usually code in Russia for them ending any form of NATO expansion in the country, and also taking over the areas that they've already, formally annexed, although not yet completely control inside Ukraine. And so, look, I mean, essentially, there was pushback from the Kremlin to the White House, to President Trump, about this idea of them bringing to an end in short order their conflict in Ukraine. And from the White House side, doesn't seem to have been much in terms of consequences for that kind of defiance, that Kremlin defiance. Trump has not, for instance, increased sanctions, or he doesn't seem to have threatened Vladimir Putin with any consequences for his refusal to stage a ceasefire, for instance.
Joining me now is Charles Kupchan, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He also served on the National Security Council for the Clinton White House. Thank you for being with us, sir.
Good to be with you.
So after this hour-long conversation between Presidents Trump and Putin, Yuri Yushakov, a senior Kremlin aide, revealed some details of what Vladimir Putin actually had said. Listen to this.
Our president also said that Russia will seek to reach the goals it has set, that is, the elimination of the well-known root causes that led to the current state of affairs, to the current acute confrontation, and Russia will not back down from these goals.
So, in other words, what Moscow is saying, it isn't willing to concede much of anything, which is directly at odds with the United States and comes without any sanctions or repercussions, it seems.
Well, I think the good news is that Trump is talking to Putin. And if the war in Ukraine is going to end, it will take U.S.-Russia dialogue and diplomacy. The bad news is this is the sixth call between Putin and Trump that we know about, and no progress has been made in bringing this war to an end. In fact, the Russians have increased the scope of their bombing campaigns against Ukraine. And as you just heard from what Ushakov said, the Russians have shown no sign that they're negotiating in good faith, no sign that they are ready to compromise and back away from their effort to get at what they call the root causes of the war. That means rolling back the post-Cold War settlement, pulling NATO forces back from the Eastern Front, getting Ukraine to recognize the eastern part of the country as part of Russia. All that is a non-starter. And so we really haven't made any progress in the negotiations.
And this Putin-Trump conversation came as the US pauses weapon shipments to the Ukrainians. And here's President Trump explaining why.
We're giving weapons, but we've given so many weapons, but we are giving weapons, and we're working with them and trying to help them, but we haven't. Biden emptied out our whole country giving them weapons, and we have to make sure that we have enough for ourselves.
That is not an accurate statement. Any drawdown of weapons from existing stockpiles have been restocked with new, more modern replacements. So is this weapons pause by the US more of a negotiating tactic here?
Well, if it is a negotiating tactic, it's the wrong one. And that's because in many respects, it undercuts Trump's effort to put coercive pressure on Putin. Putin is continuing to attack Ukraine and pursue expansive war aims because he thinks he can continue to take ground from Ukraine. And the fact is he can. And so what Trump should be doing is saying to Putin, I'm going to increase economic sanctions. I'm going to increase the flow of weapons to Ukraine. We're going to stop you from your aggression against this country. That's not what he's saying. And what happened yesterday, the pause in the flow of weapons to Ukraine, is directly at odds with Trump's efforts to negotiate an end to the war.
And when it comes to sanctions, the New York Times is reporting the US has imposed no new sanctions on Russia this year, unlike the previous administration, which imposed thousands of so-called maintenance sanctions targeting new schemes without continuous maintenance of restrictions. Russian workarounds actually can take hold. So in other words, over time, these sanctions become less effective, which seems to be the case here with Russia, which is why you need the new ones. So there does seem to be a picture emerging here that despite what the president may be saying publicly about not being happy with Russia, privately, he seems unwilling to apply any real pressure on Russia while working to weaken Ukraine's position.
You got it right. I mean, basically, he has not yet said he's going to tighten sanctions. And we don't know the answer to the $6 million question. which is when the $61 billion that Biden got out of Congress runs out, and it's going to run out this summer, is Trump going to go back to Congress and say, we need more money for Ukraine? If he doesn't, if he turns off the spigot, if there are no more U.S. weapons flowing to Ukraine, Ukraine is going to be in a very vulnerable position, and it makes it harder for Trump to get Putin to stop. And so I don't think Trump gets it yet. I think he came into office thinking that he could pick up the phone, call his bro, Mr. Putin, and tell Vladimir to stop. Well, it's not working. Now Trump needs to come around and understand that Trump will stop, that Putin will stop when he is stopped. And that means giving Ukraine what it needs to defend itself.